just watched part 1 of this presentation. I am now recording, of course, part 2. And that learning curve I talked about in part 1 is definitely showing up here. Been a bit of a challenge, a bit of a learning experience as I try to create this asynchronous material. Even in part 1, trying to convert it to a movie or an MP4 format from a PowerPoint show has been a challenging and enlightening experience. But nonetheless, we move forward. So, in this second part of this opening presentation, we are going to cover the one, perhaps most important bullet point here, which is actually going through the cost-benefit analysis step by step, according to the steps as defined in the Army Cost-Benefit Analysis Manual, or Guide, and as described in an overview previously in this presentation. So the first step in the process is to define and scope the problem or opportunity. Right? Basically, what is it? What is the need we're trying to solve? What is the objective here? Right? So describe the need, the problem, as well as describing the objective. Right? So what's the problem and what do we hope to achieve besides simply fix the problem? Right? And are we trying to improve an existing process or program, or are we trying to introduce a new process or program to address a previously unaddressed need? And it sometimes helps to frame this as a question. Right? The reason being that describing a problem without articulating the type of solution you are looking for doesn't really give any direction to the analyst, right? I think about it in terms of people who will complain to me, or let's just say talk to me about particular problems, but ultimately I'm stuck with the question, okay, well, what do you want to do about that? Do you want me just to empathize with you, or you want me to actually solve the problem? And if you want them to actually solve the problem, it helps them to frame it as a question, which requires a recommended action as a response. Then you know that you've sort of framed the problem in a way that's requesting a particular action, and then you can choose among the various courses of action to address that. This should also sort of provide the policy rationale in terms of what do we think the benefit will be in terms of improved efficiency, but also why a particular organization, a particular command, a particular entity is the right one to solve the problem. Right? Why is it the role, first of all, more broadly, why is the role of government anyway? Why is it the role of the Army? Why is it the role of that particular command? Why is it the role of that particular functional unit? Whatever it might be, to figure out who is the right entity to do it. Now, the scope here, of course, is basically to define how broadly are we going to look at solutions, how broadly are we going to measure benefits and costs, how broadly are we going to need to conduct our analysis. Right? Are we thinking in terms of a solution that covers a particular functional area, multiple functional areas, an entire organization or entire command, multiple commands, the entire Army enterprise, DoD, so on. But also in terms of time. We're looking for a solution in the short run, in the long run? Are we looking for a solution that will be in place for many years? So whether it's geography or time or somewhere in the org chart, setting limits and boundaries on, okay, let's look for a action within this scope that addresses this problem. For each of the steps here that I'm presenting in this lecture, I will actually conclude with questions to ask if you are reviewing a cost-benefit analysis. The reason is some of you will be actually conducting cost-benefit analysis, perhaps, but I imagine many or most of you may not be the analysts yourselves, but you will be reviewing and assessing others who do cost-benefit analysis. And therefore, the objective here is to make you a informed consumer of cost-benefit analysis. And so for each task, as you are reviewing a cost-benefit analysis, what sort of questions should you ask? Well, and for this first step, which is to define a scope of the problem or opportunity, among the questions you should be asking to make sure you've got a quality CBA in front of you, first, does the problem statement actually provide a clear, unambiguous issue? Right? Is it, in other words, do you actually know exactly what the problem you're trying to solve? Right? Is it clear what type of solutions, what type of courses of action might solve that? Right? Is the objective, are we looking at measuring this from an enterprise perspective? The goal and the directive from the Army is to look at it from an Army enterprise perspective. Are you looking narrowly at the benefits or the impact on a particular command or organization or entity within the Army, or are you looking overall at the entire Army enterprise perspective? And then, of course, which stakeholders are impacted and who should take action? Who's affected by this, and who's the right person? Who's the right? What's the right level? What's the right organization to address the problem or opportunity? The second step in the CBA process is to formulate assumptions and identify constraints. Now, up front, right, we think about assumptions, and we tend to believe, and which is true to some degree, that assumptions are dangerous, right? People say, hey, you shouldn't make assumptions. Don't assume, right? Well, for better or worse, they are a necessary evil of cost-benefit analysis. In fact, they're a necessary evil of any analysis, right? And my point is that the world is complex. You need to make assumptions to simplify it, right? You cannot possibly look at the entirety of any situation to analyze it. So you try to identify what are the key things to focus on, what is the most important elements, and focus only on those. Whether it be in an economic analysis, you will make assumptions and focus on particular elements, or even, a battlefield analysis. Right? When you are looking at battlefield analysis, you are not looking at every single detail. You're not focusing on every blade of grass that's out there. Only the biggest, most significant and relevant factors, and you narrow your focus to that. I think about it in terms of like a map, right? A map is a model of reality. If I have a road map of California, or I have a map of California, it is a simplification of the reality. It doesn't have every detail, but if it's a road map, it's going to have the roads and the highways and the things I need for my purposes, which would be driving. Or if it's a topographical map, perhaps I'm going hiking in Big Sur on a topographical map, then it would have the relevant detail there, right? But it is basically ignoring a significant part of reality and focusing on what the detail that is most relevant. Right? And that's the idea of any economic model or any economic analysis or any model or any analysis is a simplified representation of reality. Right? And therefore, that's why assumptions are necessary. By the way, the map example reminds me of a joke, by Stephen Wright, the comedian. And he says, I have a map of the United States. Its actual size. It says on it, 1 mile equals 1 mile. Last summer, I folded it. Again, underlining the point that if you wanted to have the entire detail of the United States, you would need a map that was actual size. But of course, it's impractical to have such a map, and therefore we make assumptions to simplify. But besides the fact that using assumptions to simplify a complex world, another thing is that even if you wanted to capture all the complexity that's there, you can't, right? It's impossible to know all the detail, right? You'll never know all the relevant parameters. You're never going to know precisely what the cost per mile will be. You'll never know precisely, you can't predict perfectly the future. So you're going to have to estimate things. You're going to have to make assumptions. And they have to be informed, intelligent assumptions, not pulling them out of the air. Right. Now, of course, the more time you have to do your analysis, the better and more precisely you can calibrate your assumptions and certainly reduce the uncertainty around them. But time and resources are scarce, right? You don't have all the time and all the money in the world to conduct a cost-benefit analysis for every project. And therefore, you ultimately have to make assumptions. And even time doesn't solve this problem, even in hindsight, right? Even when you do an ex post cost-benefit analysis, you still can't say precisely, in hindsight, even what all of the costs and all the impacts were, right? There's always going to be something that is not observed or not measurable, right? You hear people say hindsight is 20/20. Well, no, hindsight isn't 20/20. It's better than foresight. But even when you look back on things that you did or events in your life, you don't know, understand, or be able to perceive every detail of what actually happened, right? You have a selective window on what you observe, a selective memory, and ultimately hindsight might be 20/30, 20/40 compared to 20/60 or 20/80 in foresight. But even in hindsight, we ultimately have to make assumptions about what happened, and we certainly have to make assumptions about what will happen. Now, it's important, of course, to make good assumptions. You have to make assumptions, but it's important to make good ones, right? Because bad assumptions can lead to, of course, bad analysis, right? Here's a quote from one of the references posted on Sakai that's for your use as a background reference on techniques of cost-benefit analysis, is a book chapter by Stokey and Zeckhauser. And in there's the following quote, which I find interesting. Quote, "One disturbing feature of cost-benefit analysis is that, as history unfortunately shows, it offers no automatic protection against heroically bad assumptions." Right? So if you make a heroically bad assumption, you can be great at the rest of cost-benefit analysis, and you're still going to get a heroically bad analysis. Right? So good assumptions matter. Right? But making good assumptions is very difficult, especially when there's an infinite potential set of assumptions. What do I mean by infinite? Well, if you think about, you're estimating, say, the cost per mile, right? What is the actual, if you think about gas consumption, vehicle depreciation, or whatever, you might say, well, the federal government uses whatever, 50 cents a mile, so I'm going to use 50 cents a mile. Well, okay, but that's a good estimate, right? That's a good assumption, but what if it's 52 cents, 55 cents, 48 cents, right? What if it's 48.2 cents, right? There is an infinite number of possibilities. And that's only one assumption. If you have multiple assumptions, you just multiply exponentially the potential set of assumptions. So you've got a huge challenge in front of you because it's very important to make good assumptions, but the choice from which you could select is either unlimited or virtually unlimited. Now, sometimes, but the importance of good assumptions says that sometimes you don't even get to make them, right? So what if assumptions are given to you and they're not good assumptions, right? You're told, well, assume this cost, assume this factor. Well, then you should question them, right? Because ultimately you're going to produce an analysis that will lead to a recommendation, or lead to a choice, or lead to an action, right? And you want to make sure it's right. And so if assumptions are given to you, rather than accept them blindly, if you question one of them, say, well, I'm not so sure that's the best assumption. Where did that come from? Right? What about this? And certainly, you're able to, in your analysis, test alternatives. Now, most assumptions or many assumptions will not be given to you, and you have to make those assumptions yourself. It's important in your analysis and in your report in particular that you identify all the assumptions that are made and justify why. Why did you make this assumption? Where did you get that? Where did you pick that number from, and why do you think it's a reasonable number? Now, although there is no, quote, automatic protection against bad assumptions, sensitivity analysis does help correct for inaccurate assumptions. And we'll talk more about sensitivity analysis later, under step 7. But understand now, what sensitivity analysis does is basically figure out how sensitive your results and recommendations are to changes in your assumptions or other parameters. So some assumptions can be bad, but not impactful, meaning the results and recommendations are not very sensitive to that assumption. So even if you're off by 50% in your estimate, you still get the same conclusion, same recommendation. Whereas other assumptions will in fact be critical. Right? And so sensitivity analysis allows you to look for what if I made, essentially ask the question, what if I made a bad assumption? How does that change things? So sensitivity analysis is basically anticipating the fact that some of your assumptions will be wrong. More generally, just an aside, if I haven't made it obvious already, on assumptions and the perspective here, right? First, understand that the simple truth is that all economic models or analyses are wrong. What do I mean when I say that? Well, what I mean is, just like the map, every map ever made is wrong. Now, it may be wrong in ways that are not relevant, but it's wrong. It does not cover all the details. Any model, any analysis requires simplification, and therefore it's ignoring certain details, and hopefully it's ignoring the right details. But the bottom line is all economic models or analyses are wrong. However, many are nonetheless useful. What I mean by that is that although they are wrong, they are right much of the time, or they capture much of reality. They provide some useful insight, right? It may steer you at least in the right direction. It's like a rule of thumb. If you have a certain rule of thumb or certain heuristic, certain rule, hey, we generally do it this way. It works 90% of the time. It doesn't work 10% of the time. But it's not a universal rule, but it works enough that it makes sense. And that's the idea of economic models, right? Is that economists or any sort of even models in physics, you make simplifying assumptions so that you can simplify reality, but still capture the core elements so you can draw conclusions that are relevant here. Right? And the key, of course, is that you don't want to make assumptions that are so strong they ultimately dictate your answer. Right? Which sort of reminds me of a joke about economists, which says, how does an economist change a light bulb? And the answer is, well, first he assumes the light bulb has changed, and then it's changed. The point being that economists sometimes, one of the flaws, and I see this in research papers I see, is they essentially make such strong assumptions, they essentially assume their answer, right? Given these assumptions, the conclusion was inevitable, right? They didn't leave room for other possibilities because they made such strong assumptions, their conclusion is not surprising. And so you want to be careful not to do that. But you want to make the right assumptions, but only those that are sort of necessary to simplify enough to conduct your analysis. And by the way, another light bulb joke about economists is, how many economists does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is none. If the light bulb really needed changing, the free market would have already done so, right? And that goes back to our earlier discussion about the role of the Adam Smith's invisible hand and the efficiency of markets, and that we don't need to intervene in any way. Anyway, so if this is true, if the idea that we know the model is going to be wrong to some degree, but it might still be useful, what do we do? Well, the approach that I talk about is, I call it ready, aim, fire, aim again, fire again, right? Think about it this way. When you are at the shooting range, and I am not an experienced marksman, but from what I understand, when you're aiming at a target, of course, you're going to take your best shot, but if you miss a little bit to the right, you'll adjust your aim a little more to the left. And if you then shoot again, fire again, and you overcompensate too far to the left, you move a little bit back to the right. The point is, you adjust you see what the output is, and then do the process again, adjusting based on what you've learned. And that's how we do it in cost-benefit analysis or any analysis. I suggest you make initial sort of quick and dirty assumptions, right? Your sort of best guess. put some effort into it, do some analysis, put the numbers in there, make assumptions, knowing that they won't necessarily be a final assumption, but put them in there for now. Then conduct a complete analysis, identify what the results and recommendations are, and then go back and say, well, what if these assumptions are wrong? And change them a little bit. Change the assumptions one way or the other, and see how, then conduct the analysis again, see how the results and recommendations change. The point is that if there will be certain variables, certain assumptions, that when you change them significantly, they have no significant effect on the results or recommendations. Does that mean they don't matter? No, it doesn't mean they don't matter. You still want to get as accurate as possible, but you certainly don't want to devote a lot of time getting a precise estimate on a parameter that really is not going to impact your results. You should instead identify those assumptions that actually matter, that if they're off by a little bit here or there, they change the results recommendation, and those are the assumptions which you spend a lot of time focusing on and making sure you're getting your estimates correctly, that you're assuming as little as possible, you're reducing the uncertainty of those assumptions. So given limited time and limited resources, focus on the assumptions that matter. And that's why I recommend that you initially just do a quick and dirty assumptions and do a quick and dirty analysis, right? Because I don't want you to devote a lot of time to assumptions that ultimately might not matter that much. Right? And that's the idea of sensitivity analysis, is the idea of figuring out which assumptions actually matter and how sensitive your results are to those assumptions. Right? It's also, some of you may be familiar with the OODA loop, and it's also the same idea here, right? The ready, aim, fire again, fire again, right? OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act, right? And then do it again. It's why it's a loop. Then observe again. After the action, observe, orient, decide, act. Then observe, orient, decide, act. That's the idea. And the OODA loop, or this iterative approach that I'm prescribing here, will allow you to identify the assumptions that matter the most and most accurately make the estimates that go into those assumptions. Just for an example of what assumptions you might see, right? If you look at the actual cost-benefit analysis that was done for the Clean Air Act, right, it makes assumptions on things like the number of lives saved for each level of emission reduction, the number of illnesses prevented for each level of emission reduction, and how air quality and visibility will improve. Right? If we reduce sulfur dioxide emissions by 100,000 tons, we will save X number of lives and reduce Y number of illnesses, right? And improve air quality to this degree. Now, those are assumptions that are necessary to figure out whether it makes sense to reduce emissions by how much. Now, where do they get those assumptions? Do they just pull them out of the air for the Clean Air Act? No pun intended. Of course not. No, they use data to figure out the relationship between, for example, pollution and illness and life-threatening illness and air quality, right? And they make estimates. They say, well, we estimate that. So sometimes we call something an assumption, but really what it is an estimate. Let's be clear. It's not something that you just assumed without any evidence, right? It's an educated guess, an educated assumption. It's an estimate. By the way, of course, they would also then need to figure out, well, how do we trade off? We save so many lives. What does that mean in terms of dollars, right? Because it's going to reduce, the Clean Air Act might reduce national output because of the restrictions on businesses by $100,000, whatever it might be. How do you compare lives to dollars? Well, there are ways to do that. We'll talk about that in the course, right? But ultimately, you do have to put a dollar figure, estimate the dollar value of a life, is another assumption that would go into that. Here's a more hypothetical example, but closer to home, I guess. Suppose there's a cost-benefit analysis on whether the library for Belvoir should be closed. The on-base library should be closed or not. Right? Well, if you did that cost-benefit analysis, you might see assumptions such as, estimates to figure out how often people on base actually want access to a library. Right? Now, would you just pick a number? No, you wouldn't pick a number. You might look at what data is available. You might talk to the librarians. You might observe. You might actually just sit there and observe on a given day, how many people go into the library. You might do a survey, right? You might look at existing data on that. So again, it's an educated guess. It's not just a pull out of the air guess, right? But also you need to figure out, okay, well, what about the value of time? If personnel who do want access to a library, or maybe need it for their job, right, to document a report or something they're doing, if they spend time driving to an off-base library, how do we value that time that is spent doing that? Whether that time is during their working day, or maybe it's time they spend in their personal time. Is there a difference in terms of the value of those, right? How do we value, it doesn't necessarily cost the Army, but it costs the service member. How do we value that? Of course, the vehicle and gas costs associated with the extra driving distance. Right? And also recognize that some folks who might use the library on base won't use the library if it's off base, right? And maybe they should, right? Maybe for their job, the reason we have a library on base, and the reason it has references that are relevant to the military, right, and that may not be available online, is that we want folks who are maybe producing analyses or reports to actually research them, right? There's going to be some folks who don't bother. They don't research all the details. They research only some of them, or they don't research things at all that they really should, and therefore you can have lost productivity or lost performance. How do you measure that? These are all sort of assumptions that would go into this sort of hypothetical cost-benefit analysis. All right, well, if that's assumptions, that's actually only part of the step here, right? It says formulate assumptions and identify constraints. So what about constraints? Well, constraints are basically, right, about limited resources primarily, right? You're going to get a constraint. A constraint, one way to think about it, is a constraint is an assumption that is given to you, right? As the analyst, or you're sort of told, look, you got $1 million. What's the best solution you can get for $1 million, right? We have to do it within a month. What's the best solution you can get within a month? We have to do this. Whatever we only have, 30 staff members to devote to this. What can you do with only 30 staff members? Any limit, whether it be labor, time, money, space, any sort of limit on resource that you're given ex ante, sort of going into the process, is a constraint. And it's sort of treated as if it's an assumption that's given to you. Now, these constraints are usually beyond the control of the analyst, or even maybe the analyst's boss, but they're not necessarily beyond the control of the organization as a whole, right? So understand that, you may be directed, or somebody, your organization or your function may be directed to do a cost-benefit analysis of this problem, figuring out what solution we can get by spending only $1 million. But it may be that you can't get a very good solution for that. And so you may go back and say, here's what we get with that constraint, but can we expand that constraint? Can we spend 1.2, 1.5? And it may be a constraint as something that can be changed in the process because it's an overly restrictive constraint in terms of reaching a solution. What sort of questions should you ask as you review a cost-benefit analysis that somebody else has done related to step 2? Well, basically, right, this is the assumptions and constraint. Are they realistic? Are you making good assumptions? Do the constraints make sense, right? Are we putting the appropriate limits, or are we limiting too much? Our courses of action and our possible outcomes. Where do the assumptions come from, right? If you say, okay, yes, I've identified the assumption, but where did you get that number? If they made it up, that's not a good answer, right? But what type of analysis, what data they looked at, what type of research they did do to at least approximate or create the estimate that was their assumption. When they didn't have maybe particular data, did they consult a subject matter expert, to sort of get that? How did they go about, formulating that assumption, right? Are the assumptions, do they seem biased in favor of a certain course of action? As I already mentioned, one of the indictments of economists is that they make assumptions, and then they have, with those assumptions, they get a certain conclusion, and the conclusion is obvious. We would use the word in logic, it's tautological, right? It's necessary that one follows from the other. So if you make assumptions that sort of bias your conclusion in favor of one particular or a certain set of courses of action, then you've got to double check those assumptions, because either they may be an unconscious or even conscious bias coming in, But you want to make sure that you're giving a fair playing field before you proceed. Right. Also, related to sensitivity analysis, we already talked about this, is when you're thinking about assumptions, we're going to want to know what assumptions really matter, right? You can give me a list of assumptions, but I want to know which ones should I really care about, right? Which ones did you find through your sensitivity analysis, which ones do you find were significant in terms of affecting the final results or recommendation? Now, the third step in the CBA process is to define the alternatives, right? And what we're talking about here is what are our options? What are our choices? What are our possible courses of action, right, to solve the problem? And of course, when we think about what we can do, one of the options that you should always consider, if not always include, is the status quo. Basically, keeping things the way they are. Some would say, and I think it's fair in some cases, if the status quo is inevitably going to change anyway, right? Then comparing it to status quo is not really a fair comparison. If, for example, you're not so much figuring out how to tweak an existing process, but the idea of there is maybe a new need that has arisen that has never been addressed before. So maybe you don't want to look at the status quo because you're ultimately looking at options to address a need that must be addressed. But even in those cases, I think it's fair to say that doing nothing may always be an option. Right? Now that doesn't mean status quo, right? Because if you do nothing, things will change. But doing nothing, has to be considered. And doing nothing is often an option that people choose when it comes to problems. I got lots of problems in my life. And what do I sometimes I do nothing. Because you know what? My energy is better spent focusing on very particular problems, the most important problems, and not, all the little problems that come across my desk or come into my life. Right? So sometimes doing nothing may be the best solution. So you always got to consider that. Also, although you're often given, told when you do cost-benefit analysis, hey, look, I want you to compare these two options or these three options. You're often told the alternatives you are to compare by the decision maker. But don't limit yourself to those, right? The decision maker might have those in mind. The entire point of doing an outside objective third-party analysis is to think outside the box, to look at it from a different perspective. So it's not that you're defying the decision maker if you look at something that he or she did not recommend, but you are offering an alternative lens. So consider that, right? And if they say, I want you to compare A, B, and C, and you say, sir, ma'am, I compared A, B, and C, but I also thought about D, and I compared that, and look how D compares relative to the options, right? Besides your own different perspective from the decision maker, another one to look at is think about getting input from other stakeholders, right? From different sides of the problems, different parties who might be affected by the decision, right, might have very different perspectives about possible options. Right? People tend to think very narrowly about options that they have seen or experienced or thought about or talked about, and it's very difficult to think otherwise. Right? Even though we have this prescription here, you should think outside the box. That's a lot easier said than done. Now we think about thinking outside the box. What do we say? Well, people will often say, well, did you consider all available options? To which I would say, one, no, because there could be an infinite number of all available options that I consider a reasonable number, a representative sample of all available options. Okay, that's one thing. But even if that question is unfair, it's the wrong question. Because it's too limiting. Don't just consider the available options, create new ones that didn't exist before. And to get an idea of thinking about that, think about the reading that is posted on Sakai that I've asked you to read for this week called Create Better Alternatives. It's a chapter from a book by Henderson and Hooper, and it's very interesting. A number of different stories in there that talk about this. And one of the lessons on that is that when you're thinking about alternatives or options for or possible solutions, is instead of going, okay, I got a problem, these are the solutions, these are the possible options. In other words, going directly from I got to change the status quo to these are the potential options. Focus instead on, wait a minute, what's the real need here? What's the objective you're trying to achieve? Right? And so focus on the need or the objective rather than the possible solutions to that objective. Because when you start talking about possible solutions, you sort of put yourself in comparable sort of outcomes. The good story, I think the best story in that reading, in that chapter that sort of talks about that, is the story about where my colleague here at NPS, David Henderson, was on vacation with his family, and he didn't like the hotel he was staying in, and so they shopped around to see at the last minute, could they switch hotels, and what were the options? Well, and it turned out that they could switch hotels, but it would cost them an extra $100 per night. Should they do it? Well, the reality, they said, wait a minute, $100 per night, wow, I don't like the hotel we're in, but step back. What don't you like about the hotel you're in? What is the real problem? And he figures out that, well, the real problem is that they've got these terrible pillows. I hate the pillows in the hotel. And so I want to go to a different hotel that has better pillows. Well, wait a minute. Do you want to spend $100 a night to do that? Or do you want to go and just simply buy new pillows? By focusing in, and he ended up, the end story is that he just went out and bought new pillows. At Walmart or Target or whatever, and spent a lot less than $100 a night to do so. And slept in comfort in his previous original hotel. The point being, if you focus on what the objective is, as opposed to what you naturally think are the solutions to your problem, you might think of new alternatives. One story that always resonated with me, and maybe will with you, maybe not, but I remember talking about this sort of idea in lectures on innovation when I was at Harvard, and they said, when you're trying to sort of, basically this is the idea of solve a customer's need, don't think about the product they're asking about, think about the need they're trying to solve, right? And customers will ask for the product that they think solves their need, but you really want to identify what it is their need. And meaning, the example is, when someone buys a drill at the hardware store, do they want a drill? Well, yes, but the drill is only a means to an end. What they really want is holes, right? They're buying a drill to make holes, right? And so what they want is a hole or holes, and their way to do that is a drill. But maybe there's another way to do it, right? But the point is that focus on what the customer or the person or what the organization is really trying to achieve as an objective, and then think about alternative ways to achieve that objective, and instead of focusing on sort of traditional sort of solutions to that problem. Also, think broadly when you think about alternatives. Think very broadly. Suppose that the idea of maybe we're going to thinking about buying a new resource that we might use. Who knows? A copy machine. Or we might. So let's use the example of a copy machine. Why not? A big, high-powered, office copying machine. Well, you might price the different prices for a Canon or a Xerox or whatever the companies are that make copiers. But you should also think, wait a minute, do we even need a new copier? Can we get a used copier? Why, look at used versus new. Do we need to even own it? Can we rent it? Is there a rental service? We rent the copier, we don't actually own it. Because of depreciation, it makes more sense to rent than own. So compare rent versus own. Also, wait a minute, why do this at all? We can have a basic copier, and for our more complicated copier needs, we outsource it, right? We have, somebody else, a service, Kinko's, whoever it is, who does that sort of document processing for us. Right? Also, maybe instead of going it alone, we partner. Why don't we share this? We have this command, but we're also co-located with this command. Why don't we share a high-powered copier and partner it instead of going it alone? So again, think broadly about the alternative. Don't just think about the different copiers you could buy. Think about used versus new, rent versus own, in-house versus outsource, going alone versus partnering. Think much more broadly about the possible alternatives. Another one that's sort of a natural, right, is to create hybrids. So if you're looking at option A, B, and C, and you see that, hey, option A is really the low cost, option B has really high performance, and option C has lower performance but greater output, right? You'd love to have all three of those things. Well, maybe you can, right? Create a hybrid among those options that combines the best element. Figure out whether you can do a little bit of A, a little bit of B, a little bit of C, or create a whole new option, which is D, that combines, the best of A, B, and C. Like the previous step on formulating assumptions, where I said do a quick and dirty, make quick and dirty assumptions and then go back and revise them, you may do that with this step as well. It may be iterative as well. One approach is to simply, if great creative options don't come to mind right away, they may come to mind during the process. And what do I mean by that? So take the options that are obvious to you, that come to you, conduct your analysis, see how that comes out, and revise your options, based on what comes out. You say, wow, these options tended to be very costly because of the labor that was used. So what about an option that used less labor? Let me think. Hey, this would use less labor, right? The idea is once you know what's driving the costs and driving the benefits, you may then be able to think outside the box, think about options that maximize those benefits or minimize those costs. So you can revise it based on what you learned during the analysis, right? Now that said, there's all this talk about be creative, think of new options, expand, think about, analyze everything. Well, that's not really realistic, right? You've got we already said limited time, limited resources. Sometimes the issue is you got to narrow the options, right? Typically, cost benefit analysts will only look at most 6 or 7, maybe 2 or 3 in a lot of cases, right? And so the idea is that you will often have the opposite task. Instead of thinking about expanding the possible alternatives, you might have to limit them, right? But how do you limit them? The key is to be creative enough or have the right skills to be able to select the right set that you should focus on. One way to sort of limit your focus is to, and this may seem obvious, but in many cases it's not, throw out the infeasible alternatives. Things that you can't do. It ain't going to happen. Right? And what I find is that sometimes there's certain alternatives that people or organizations think should happen, right? That you may say, hey, look, this is affecting our command or our organization, but it's not our fault. It's somebody else's fault, and they should, be the ones to fix it. Well, as I've told friends who come to me with similar advice, who say, or similar issues, say, gosh, why is it that Bob always does this? That's really not fair. Bob should take responsibility. Bob should do that. And I say, okay, you can wait till the end of time. Bob ain't going to do it, right? And so let go of certain options that aren't going to happen, right? You may want to have your cake and eat it too. You want everything. It's not realistic. You want to have it all you want to have, a Mercedes at a Hyundai price. It ain't going to happen, right? So one way to limit your options is to let go of what you think should happen and focus only on what can happen. And sort of related to that is the idea of consider good enough alternatives. What I mean by that is often, we go and say, here's the problem. We want to solve this problem. We want to solve this problem and solve it 100%, and we want to do it on a shoestring budget. Well, that doesn't often happen, right? Sometimes you got to accept the 80% solution, right? And you should make sure when you do your analysis that you might want to exclude the 100% solution if it's infeasible, but you also, even if it's not infeasible, you might want to make sure you're focusing on the 80% solution, right? Look at alternatives that maybe don't solve the problem 100%, but they do a pretty good job of it at a much lower cost, right? And the phrase that I like here to think about is the idea that the perfect is the enemy of the good, right? If you strive for perfection, you may avoid doing what's a good option while you wait to get the point where you can have the perfect option, and that perfect option may never present itself. The opportunity may never be there, right? And so striving for perfection sometimes prevents us from doing what we should do when perfection is unachievable, and that is a good option. question directly from an Army brief that says, have all feasible alternatives been considered? Right. As I've already sort of hinted, I think that's an unfair question because there could be an infinite number of all feasible alternatives. So a better question is actually the one down lower, which says, do the alternatives span a reasonably wide range of potential solutions? Right. Because sometimes it's a fair question to ask, right? Have you looked at all feasible alternatives? But understand that truthfully there might be an infinite number of feasible alternatives. But have a fair number of all reasonable alternatives been explored and a broad range of them as opposed to a only select very, alternatives that are relatively similar. Have creative or innovative options been developed? When you pick up the CBA, do you look at it and go, are you not surprised? Oh, okay, you looked at, the things that, you looked at the options that everybody does. Okay, yeah. That doesn't mean that they did a bad job, but you ask them, did you think about this? And if the answer is, yeah, we thought about this, this, and this, and they can name to you courses of action they thought about but didn't analyze, then they've at least tried to be creative or innovative, right? So make sure that at least given that the effort. Is the status quo analyzed? Is it included, or is there some reason for its absence, right? Is there a promising but unexamined hybrid among the alternatives? Can you see ways to combine two things? This alternative is good and this one is good too, but they each have disadvantages. Is there a possible hybrid among them? And finally, right, are they leading into the next step, which is going to be our analysis? Are they clearly defined enough, right? Is this alternative, they're not saying, well, we should increase our funding of this. We should vaguely focus more on this. No, is the alternative defined clearly enough, that we can actually quantify and have identify costs and benefits, but also precisely quantify them, right? Telling me you're going to increase the focus on this does not allow me to quantify the cost of that or the benefit of that. If you tell me what you're going to spend $10,000 more on doing this, then I can have a conversation with you. So make sure that COAs are defined precisely enough that they make the subsequent analysis itself precise. So let's consider, if you will, an example of how to creatively perhaps create alternatives. This is an example that I actually saw in a Army CBA presentation. So suppose because of the base relocation and closure, because of BRAC moves, that the transportation office at a particular base will have to process property shipments for 3 times the number of people that it normally serves. The current process is based on face-to-face meetings with individuals and manual preparation of forms, right? And the increased workload level is expected to last for 3 to 4 years. Well, the conventional non-creative solution is to, since the workload factor is increasing by workload is increasing by a factor of 3, then simply triple the office's manpower. 3 times the workload will give you 3 times the manpower. But that may not be the best solution, right? In particular, don't assume that all of the existing policies, business practices, procedures, everything that's going on, regulations, that it can't be changed, right? Yes, maybe if they don't change what they're doing and it's very labor intensive and therefore they have to do more work, yeah, you do have to increase manpower staffing, right? So it's got to be one of the solutions. But think more creatively, right? We already talked about the idea of outsourcing. Maybe the outsource part of the process, right? Maybe it can be done, at least less expensive, outsourced. What about if you automate it, right? If you automate the process, right, it may require some investment, but ultimately it may lower your staff needs, and you may, with the same staff or a minimal increase in staff, be able to service the new workload. Or maybe you can change the process in terms of reducing the time for meetings by much of the interview that goes on in the meeting can be done online. Can be done through it online without having to take your staff's time, right? Or maybe think about all the forms and data collection and that goes on now. Maybe there's too many. Maybe there's too much information. Maybe there's too much process, too much bureaucracy, if you will, right, that is unnecessary. So challenge the existing requirements, to see if you can streamline the process. Again, if you tend to narrowly think about, the way things are, as opposed to the way things could be, it's difficult to be innovative. I, for example, have worked, in the acquisition field, and I will come up with creative sort of approaches to problems and say, hey, well, if that's the problem, what if you did it this way? What if you changed the process this way? And I'll be frank, I get a lot of response, which is, well, can't do that. That's against the FAR. The FAR doesn't allow that. Okay, maybe the FAR needs a change, right? Or maybe some other, whatever regulation might be. But this idea, this mindset, that's the way it's going to be. We can't change that. Well, when you have that mindset, you are closing off the possibility of what may be creative or innovative solutions. And a quote that I sort of like to put at the end of this here is from George Bernard Shaw, which he says, "Some men see things as they are and ask why. Others dream of things that never were and ask why not." In being creative and thinking out of the box, we want you to be the latter type, right? Look at not what is and what was, but think more broadly about what hasn't been and what could be. So the fourth step here in the analysis is to develop cost estimates, right? And if you look at step 4 and 5, step 4 is about looking at cost, step 5 is about looking at benefits, right? And as you'll see later, I'm not so sure that's the right way to break it down, right? Is to identify and quantify costs, then identify and quantify benefits. I'm not sure is the right division, but for now we'll take it as given. Now, when you do this, of course, the idea is, I'm sure as cost managers, right, you've had a lot of experience, presumably, in doing this. So I'm probably, not telling you anything you don't already know. But of course, you've got to, make sure you're capturing the entire, the costs over the entire time frame, discounting, for costs. We'll talk about that later. But also, in terms of the time frame, focus not only on the upfront one-time costs, but the recurring costs, the costs of maintenance, the costs of operation, the costs of replacement, the future costs, depending upon the alternative that you choose. It's also important to ensure an apples-to-apples comparison, meaning that sometimes they will be the way that costs are sort of categorized, or if you think about the different cost structure, you want to make sure that you're comparing all elements, labor, technology, time, whatever it might be, across all alternatives, right? Don't change the scope, don't change the assumptions, don't change the constraints from one course of action to another, and make sure you're looking at all elements, the same cost elements for all of your alternatives. What sort of questions should you ask when reviewing a cost-benefit analysis report in terms of the costs? How you're looking at everybody? Are you looking at how not just the costs to this command or this function, but more broadly to other commands that might be affected, other operations that might be affected? Are you looking at throughout the life cycle? Are you doing this apples-to-apples comparison of costs we talked about, right? And have you provided the data? Explain to me where these costs came from, right? And part of that is to make sure that your costs are well-founded, and part of it is actually to make sure that if we go back and want to double-check this, that we can replicate your cost-benefit analysis. What if we decide, what if you or whoever did the cost-benefit analysis for you is long gone, and you say, well, what if we change this assumption? What if we looked at this? You might want to repeat the cost analysis with a cost-benefit analysis with a few new assumptions, and therefore in order to, again, make an apples-to-apples comparison to the previous cost-benefit analysis, you want to be able to know what data they used. So step 5, now going from cost to benefits, is identify the quantifiable and non-quantifiable benefits. Again, not a great title here because Notice the previous one was develop cost estimates, and this one is identify, but you actually want to go beyond identifying the benefits. You want to actually quantify the benefits. Things that are not quantifiable, you may want to try to make quantifiable. And we'll talk a bit about that. We all know what a benefit is. Something good that happens from something you do, right? But being able to identify broadly all the different benefits, you may want to think about, particularly when it comes to, indirect or more subjective benefits, maybe non-quantifiable, then you might want subject matter experts, right, who might know, well, what are the impacts are, because you're not always going to have, particularly on the benefit side, costs are well documented, but the benefit side are something that you may not be observed or may not be well documented. You may not fully anticipate what the benefits might be. And when thinking about benefits, and I'll talk more about this in the next slide, you could think about them as they could be objective or subjective, and they could be quantifiable or non-quantifiable. Right? And we'll talk about what falls into the different categories there on the next slide. But first, let me talk about, when you are reviewing a CBA and thinking about benefits, right? What sort of questions might you want to ask? Some similar to things you asked about cost, but also the idea of, are you looking at benefits from an enterprise perspective, the overall Army enterprise, or are you looking at it narrowly in terms of a single command or organization, right? Are the benefits consistent with the problem statement, right? One of the benefits had better be to solve the problem. Otherwise, that's not really, you're looking at, maybe you're looking at good benefits, but you're not looking at the benefit that was the whole point of the exercise to begin with. And also, has there been some effort made to quantify subjective benefits, right? We'll talk about subjective benefits in a second, but too often people just throw up their hands and say, oh, well, can't measure that. Well, maybe you can. So speaking of which, thinking about categories of potential benefits, right? As I said, you can sort of talk about them objective, subjective, and quantifiable, non-quantifiable. Well, first, let's think about objective versus subjective. Objective are things that you can observe. There's no question that there's been a benefit, right? Whether it be cost savings, right? Reduced cycle time, increased revenue, right? Improved readiness, right? Something that is a measurement. You see an improvement in the measurement, then that's objectively a benefit. Now, those are generally quantifiable because the way we just defined objective. I defined objective as being something that's measurable. So if it's an observable and measurable increase, therefore, and objective means sort of you can't argue it, right? Then presumably it's something that's quantifiable. Subjective benefits are ones that are more judgment, right? Customer satisfaction, morale, capability, quality, risk, perception. These things are a little more squeaky, if you will. Can you measure them? Actually, you can probably measure all of these, right? But they're subjective in the sense that even if you had some measure, right? Some people would think that, for this service member, morale's gone up, for the other service member, morale's gone down. But you can measure maybe overall morale, with surveys or other instruments. Capability certainly can be measured in terms of different performance. So there are ways to quantify many that might be subjective. Some subjective benefits may not be quantifiable, though. Yet, I wouldn't throw my hands up at that. You may want to still quantify them anyway, right? We'll talk about this, as we go through the course, but things like public perception of the Army, well, you may not be able to quantify it exactly, but between three alternatives, that maybe alternative A will increase positive perception of the Army, B will have no effect on perception of the Army, and C will will reduce or increase the negative perception of the Army, right? Well, then you can at least rank them. You can give a positive point to one, and 0 points to another, and negative 1 point to another, right? The weights we talked about, if you sort of score them, rank them, or whatever, there is a way to sort of quantify them, almost anything, right? If you at least know that there's been a benefit, or you can compare the benefit of one alternative versus another. As I mentioned, the Army cost-benefit analysis approach recommends sort of separating your step 4 is cost, step 5 is benefits. Let me step back and talk broadly about sort of cost and benefits in general and quantifying them, which will actually be much of this course. Will all be about this. And this slide perhaps should probably be called the ugly truth about cost and benefits. So I'm going to give you sort of, the challenge, if you will, in terms of cost and benefits. Now, whether it's a cost or a benefit, it will probably fall into one of 3 categories. Either it'll be something that's easy to quantify, right? It's a dollar figure. We can see it, we know it, we can quantify it easily. Boom! Makes cost-benefit analysis easy. Don't have to make a lot of assumptions, and we can do a simpler analysis. Those are the types of cost benefits everyone loves, or at least cost-benefit analysts love. The second category, they may like, right? They're difficult to quantify, but they can be estimated, right? Things that you don't necessarily know the cost of lost time, but you can estimate it based on wages or opportunity costs, things like that. The probability of future event, you're not sure what the probability of something occurring is, but you know that it's probably, maybe about an 80% likelihood if you do option A, and maybe only about a 60% likelihood if you do option B. You can certainly do some sort of estimate, right? The value of life, the value of providing childcare, right? There's some way to do those things, right? By the way, things like value of providing childcare, I've done a lot of work in non-monetary benefits and the use of non-monetary benefits in the military, and prescribing ways to do them, and what about not only quantifying them, but monetizing them, right? And actually saying, what is the value of providing childcare? By in particular, you do survey questions and say, for certain non-monetary incentives, and it's usually more things like, assignment of choice, geographic stability, maybe educational assistance, or, whatever it might be, different non-monetary incentives, and ask them, particularly when they come up for reassessment or have an opportunity for a certain retention bonus, you say, okay, how much of your bonus would you be willing to give up if we allowed you to choose where your next assignment was, or allowed you to stay where you are because maybe your kids are in high school, you don't want to take them out in the middle of high school. We can quantify and monetize exactly how much it's worth to the individuals. Of course, by the way, the problem in that is that, guess what? Almost all the non-monetary incentives we've looked at dozens and dozens of them. Some of them are highly valued. Service members would give up a big retention bonus. They may be eligible for a reenlistment bonus of $30,000. Some of them would give up the entirety. In fact, they would give back part of the salary. They would pay you money if you let them stay, maybe have geographic stability for the next 8 years, 4 years, 5 years, where it is. But others wouldn't give a dime. In fact, they would get mad if they had geographic stability. They want to be able to move around. That's why they joined the military, right? And so, in fact, for every single non-monetary incentive we looked at, a majority of the population we surveyed would not be willing to give up a single dollar of their retention or reenlistment bonus for that non-monetary incentive. So in other words, the problem with non-monetary incentives is that some people value them very, very, very highly, and they'd be willing to give up a lot of money for it, and therefore it makes sense to, give them that incentive and not give them the bonus. We save money, they are happy, they'd rather have the incentive than the non-monetary incentive than the bonus, right? But others don't value it at all. So don't waste your money by giving an incentive to somebody who doesn't value it, right? And so it gets this idea that our prescription, of course, is that you've got to make sure that you don't give the non-monetary incentives to everyone, but only those who really value it. And how do you know they really value it? Because they're willing to give up something for it, right? And maybe when it comes to reenlistment time, people are able to select from a menu of non-monetary incentives, for example, that would reduce their reenlistment or retention bonus by a dollar figure that would cover the cost of it, right? But it may be worth it, then they might rather have that non-monetary incentive than have the money equivalent. Anyway, the point being that some things can be quantified, but they're difficult to do so, right? And it may require big assumptions. And the last category are things that you might have no idea how to quantify, right? And is my last one, improved aesthetics, right? Suppose that you are thinking about how you're going to handle landscaping on the at Fort Drum or whatever, our army base, and one option will result in beautifully manicured lawns, and nice trees and everything. The grass will be green and mowed. Others, you're going to mow it less frequently. It's not going to look quite as good. Well, how do you quantify beauty, right? So certainly there are some benefits or costs that can be very difficult. You really have no idea how to quantify, right? And particularly when you get into those cases, you're really going to need sort of special decision criteria, right? When they're significant. When they're not very significant, it's not a big deal. Maybe not so much. But if there's a significant number of benefits or costs that you have no idea how to quantify, right, then you've got to be very creative in your decision criteria. Now, even if you can quantify an impact, there's a difference between quantifying it and monetizing it, right? For example, I can quantify how something improves suppose I have a new targeting system, or new weapon system, could be just a new firearm, right? And I can measure and quantify how this new system improves my targeting. For example, it could be that we increased, from whatever 3,000 yards, we hit the target 90% of the time instead of 80% of the time with the old system, right? So we can certainly quantify the benefit. We increased accuracy from 80% to 90%. I can quantify that. But how do you convert that to dollars? Okay, so it's going from 80 to 90% worth $1 million, $500,000, $2 million, $5 million? I don't know, right? How do you convert that to dollars? That's another challenge, right? Because if you really want to do a full calculation of net benefits, you've got to be able to subtract costs from benefits. You've got to be able to compare the two. And in particular, in order to compare the two, you can't say, what is 5 apples minus oranges? You've got to be able to have, again, apples to apples. You've got to be able to measure everything in the same units, preferably dollars. You want to ideally monetize everything. What's the dollar equivalent value of these things? Right? But anything where there's not a market, you don't trade a market in accuracy. You don't trade a market in life, clean air. It's difficult to monetize. There are ways, right? I can estimate how much you value your life by often you take certain safety measures. So we can look at things like, people who, how do they react to, people drive more dangerously. They increase their likelihood of dying. That sort of reflects, to some degree, how they trade off the time they get from driving faster versus the value of their life, right? So there are ways to certainly monetize these things. But some cases, if you can't monetize them, or difficult, then you might want to think about another way to sort of put everything on the same scale, right? You might not be able to convert, for example, improved accuracy into a dollar figure, but you might at least be able to look at 3 different alternatives and rate them on relative improvement of accuracy, and then rate them on relative cost difference, right? This has a 60% greater improvement in accuracy for only a 5% greater cost, right? So there is a way, there are ways that you can get both costs and benefits, or all the benefits and all the costs on the same scale, but you've got to be creative. Now, of course, understanding that measuring costs and benefits requires forecasting, right? We're talking about costs and benefits that won't necessarily be incurred now. They will be incurred in the future. You will talk about benefits over a lifetime, maybe, right? Well, guess what? The future is uncertain. It's very hard to predict, the precise impacts of something years in advance, right? The quote I like to use is by Niels Bohr, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who said, quote, "Prediction is very difficult, especially about the future," right? It is. So understand, again, ugly truth about costs and benefits, that it's going to be a difficult task, that there's going to be uncertainty because of the difficulty of forecasting. The last point here is also understand it's often unclear if an impact is a cost or a benefit, right? Sometimes things that, for example, if you save money, do you factor that in to step 4 when you do costs? So you've reduced costs, so do you subtract that from your cost side of the equation, or do you add that into your benefit side of the equation, right? And similarly, there's some costs that are actually reduced benefits, and so it's important to understand that whether it's a benefit or whether it's an increased benefit or reduced cost, or a increased cost or reduced benefit is often unclear, right? It doesn't matter for net benefits, right? Whether you add it in one side or subtract the other, the net effect are the same. Whether we add $1,000 to the benefits or subtract $1,000 to the costs, the net benefit is going to be the same, right? Whichever we choose. But sometimes, right? Some people say, what about using the cost-benefit ratio? Well, then it matters, right? If you've got a ratio, if you're doing, for example, benefits over cost, right? If you're bang for the buck, right? If you have a reduced cost, if you add it to the numerator, that's not going to have the same effect as subtracting it from the denominator, right? I don't want to get into the math of it, right? But there's a reason why we don't tend to like using benefit cost ratios for that reason, because it's you could change your decision. The result in your recommendation could change based on whether or not you called it a reduction in cost or an increase in benefits. So what are some guidelines for how you measure cost of benefits? The first thing is just to make sure you identify all the cost of benefits. Thoroughly understand the process. If you're talking about a new process, who's affected? Literally go get a workflow, get a flow chart of what's going to happen of the new post process. Who's going to be affected? Who they're going to get inputs from, outputs to? Who they're going to interact with? Right? Understanding all the aspects of it, so you know all the resources that might be necessary, but also know who might be affected, who will benefit, who will cost, what holders, what are other processes that might be affected, right? You want to focus, you might reduce costs here, but you might increase costs somewhere else, right? But that requires you to thoroughly understand how what you're recommending or looking at actually works. Of course, you should discount the value of costs or benefits that come in the future. $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow, or $1 next year in particular. We'll talk much more about that later in the course, so I won't emphasize that right now. You also, of course, need to be sure to consider things, not only the upfront costs, but also, or upfront costs or benefits, but also the recurring impacts, continuing benefits, continuing costs. Make sure you're focusing on all relevant stakeholders and what the impact is, cost or benefit on them. And, look at everything in terms of safety, security, technology. When you, for example, on the cost side, it may not just be an increase in labor. There may be a new technology you need to purchase. There may require greater security. They may involve greater risk or lower risk. All these things, should think very broadly about impacts in all these areas and in terms of costs and benefits, right? And understand that the greater the uncertainty you have about your assumptions, about your quantification of your costs and benefits, the greater uncertainty you have, the greater the importance of sensitivity analysis, which we'll talk about in some great detail later, right? Because that will tell you, if you have a lot of uncertainty, that means that you want to make sure that if you're wrong on some of these costs or wrong on some of these benefits, that if you're wrong by a little bit, it doesn't make a big difference. And that's the role of sensitivity analysis. So step 6 of the cost-benefit analysis approach is to define the alternative selection criteria. Basically, this is saying, how are we going to make our decision? How are we going to rank these things? What is the criteria? What are the dimensions of which you're going to compare them? Right? How are we going to choose the alternative? I actually think this is a very confusing name for this step. Define alternative selection criteria, right? Okay, so are you saying we need selection alternatives among the selection criteria? No, actually that's not what it means. You're not defining alternative criteria to be used for selecting. It's actually, you're talking about criteria for selecting an alternative, right? Remember, step 3 was define the alternative, so this is define the alternative selection criteria. Selection criteria among those alternatives. So very confusing, at least to me, when you read it, right? But understand this is basically what are the criteria that are going to allow you to choose an alternative or rank the alternatives or assess the alternatives, right? And so you're of course going to talk about, you have to justify, why you chose those particular alternatives. Now, the criteria, if everything's monetizable, it's pretty easy, right? And that's what we'll talk about on the next slide here. Because if indeed everything is monetizable, right, then you just look at net benefits. You can figure out the total benefits in dollar figures, total costs. The difference is the net benefits. Select the course of action which maximizes the net benefit, has the highest net benefit. But if not all impacts are monetizable, it becomes a difficult step, right? How do you do it? How do you compare different the alternatives, the different COAs, if it's not all in dollar terms, right? If some benefits are in, increase customer satisfaction by 50% or 10%, or improve our output by 320 units. Well, how do I compare that to dollars in terms of costs? So you may want to reconsider maybe how things are measured, right? If you can't get everything to be monetizable, maybe you've got to do a score, right? Maybe you've got to say, okay, this one performs very well in terms of cost, so I'll give it 10 points. This one performs it doesn't perform as well in terms of customer satisfaction, so I'll only give it 5. You may want to have a subjective scoring, similar to, in some sense, what, Benjamin Franklin did, right? When you can't put everything into money terms, maybe you want to compare everything along a different dimension. What questions would you ask as a reviewer in this case, right, about the selection criteria? Of course, are they appropriate given the problem statement? Are we choosing something that solves the problem, right? Are we considering both cost and non-cost criteria? Or if we're just focused on cost, that's too narrow. How are we combining or comparing monetizable and non-monetizable impacts? Like I just said, something that's not monetizable, how do we compare them? How do we compare a $10,000 cost to a 6% increased productivity? How do we compare those? If we're using weights, like I said, you could do something where you score their performance along different criteria and then assign weights to each of the criteria. Are the weights appropriate? Do they make sense? Also along that line, do the criteria seem unfairly skewed to favor one alternative versus another, right? If you heavily weight a certain area, that tends to push it in favor of obviously alternatives that perform well in that area. Is that justifiable, or is it possibly the result of some bias? You construct the analysis in a way that produces the result you wanted all along. Right? Which, let me tell you, as a consultant, happens all the time. When I was working for Booz Allen Hamilton, somebody says, we want you to come in and do a study, a cost-benefit analysis of these 3 options, but I really want to do option B. So the person paying the bills is telling you what they want the result to be. It becomes difficult, right? Because you're naturally going to want, and the client's going to be towards, selection criteria that favor their already presupposed outcome. Step 7 is the actual comparison, right? Now we're going to compare alternatives. We're going to figure out which ones we want to choose. We're going to compare them, right? And the depends on your version of the Army Cost Benefit Guide has changed over time, but there are either sort of 4 or 5 sort of things that the Army CBA guide breaks it down into. So we have 7A through 7E. A is simply the actual comparison. Compare the costs, the course of action using the selection criteria you chose in the previous step, and identify what's the preferred. You rank them, and you choose your optimal. The next step, again, if there's a bill associated with the COA, identify the bill payer. Make sure you determine the second and third order effects and how to manage those impacts. We'll talk about each of these in a little more detail. Determine the robustness of the conclusions. This is the sensitivity analysis, how the conclusions change if certain assumptions or costs or benefits change. And finally, sort of a 7E is sort of a risk management, risk assessment, risk management task. Identifying the risks and how we're going to mitigate those. Now, you'll notice, by the way, and you'll see where I want to sort of explain when I talk about revising the process. That's a lot of stuff. When step 7 really just says compare alternatives. How is 7B identifying the bill payer for the chosen course of action? How is that comparing the alternatives? It's actually not, right? Because that's assuming you've already chosen a course of action. Now you're identifying the bill payer, right? And then you're determining the second, third order effects. B, C, D, and E are actually after you've already made the comparison. 7A is really the only one that's a comparison. So you might see, and you'll see when I talk about revising it, why these might want to be broken down into different steps. But they all are sort of things that have to be done, so the Army Guide lumps them into step 7 here. Now, let's focus first on, of course, 7A. 7A is the actual comparison, right, and how we choose. We've already sort of said, I can give you other examples, but here's the simple case, is that when things are monetizable, and whenever possible, the preferred course of action would be the one that has the greatest net benefit, total benefits minus total costs. And to give you some insight here, we have this table, which is a little bit no-brainer, if you will, in some sense. But think about this, you could have equal costs or unequal costs. That's the first column. You could have unequal benefits or equal benefits. That's the second column, right? So there's four possibilities here. And let me actually start from the bottom and work my way up. If we have unequal costs but equal benefits, right? So consider, for simplicity, we have two alternatives, the same benefit, they achieve the same goal equally well, but they have unequal costs. Which one do you choose? Well, of course, you select the alternative with the lowest cost to provide the given benefit. Right? Benefits are equal, so you focus on the differences in costs. This is actually cost effectiveness analysis. Cost effectiveness analysis is basically saying, how do we achieve a given benefit at the lowest cost? Right? You're not comparing benefits either because you can't measure them or you want a specific objective. We want this precise widget at the lowest possible cost. So the benefits are ex ante set up to be all the same. Right? That's cost-effective analysis, and that's sort of an easy decision criterion. You select the alternative with the lowest cost to provide the given benefit. Now, when you have unequal costs, but moving one step up, unequal costs, but unequal benefits, right? This is the real fun, complicated. This is real nitty-gritty cost-benefit analysis, right? Now we have unequal costs, unequal benefits. You can't select the lowest cost alternative. You can't select the highest benefit alternative. Instead, you've got to select the alternative with the greatest net benefit, right? Total benefits minus total costs. Moving up one more, we get I don't know if it's the easiest or if it's the hardest, because it sort of makes the decision hard. What if you have equal costs and equal benefits? Well, then cost-benefit analysis tells you nothing. Or it tells you that you've got to look elsewhere, right? Because according to cost-benefit analysis, they have the same net benefits. In fact, they have the same costs and the same benefits, right? So you've got to use some other criterion. Is there some other reason that you would choose A versus B? Something that's not captured in the cost-benefit analysis, some subjective reasoning, right? Or, flip a coin. If the cost-benefit analysis captures everything of relevance, then seriously, the alternatives are all equal to the coin. And finally, at the very top here, what if costs are equal but benefits are unequal? Right? If costs are equal and benefits are unequal, right? So everything has the same cost but different benefits. Then we're talking about what is our bang for the buck, right? Select the alternative that provides the greatest benefit for the given cost. Right? And this is actually what is known as benefit effectiveness analysis, although you never hear that. But but it's the counterpart to cost effectiveness analysis. Cost effective analysis was where at the bottom where we had equal benefits, and we wanted to find the one that was lowest cost to produce a given benefit. This is the greatest benefit you can achieve at a given cost, right? We've got $1 million to spend. Where can we get the greatest bang for that buck, right? That is the idea of benefit effectiveness analysis, and you choose among the alternatives that all have the same cost. You choose the one that has the greatest benefit. (7) B and 7C. 7B is identify the bill payer. That is of course, a little more administratively, an administrative task, right? Figure out who the funding source, who's going to pay for it, to identify the cost of the recommended course of action, right? In most of the cases, the folks who are developing the cost-benefit analysis won't necessarily have the authority to identify the bill payers. So it may require some collaboration with the organization, resource manager, prioritizer, etc. Right? Who's going to pay for this? The step 7C determines second and third order effects, right? These are the ripple effects, of a course of action, right? The idea that the recommended course of action might solve a problem, but it might also create additional factors that must be addressed. My opinion is that ideally those should have been included in steps 4 and 5, right? You should include second and third order benefits, second and third order costs in your cost-benefit analysis. So I'm not really clear why it comes up here, but maybe it's sort of once you've got your chosen alternative, doing a more deep analysis of that alternative. Step 7D is the sensitivity or robustness analysis, testing your result for robustness. Sensitivity analysis basically reveals how different uncertainties affect the results of recommendation. How confident we could be in this conclusion? If you're recommending me, option B, how confident can we be? And you can tell me, well, even if we're off on our assumptions by 20% one way or the other, we still find that option B is the best one. Then maybe I can be pretty confident, right? But the idea is you're saying, how does the results or recommendation change, right, when we change constraints, assumptions, costs, benefits, criteria, weights, sorts of things, right? And of course, you could look at sensitivity analysis for any variable you wanted, but ideally you want to focus on those elements where there is the most uncertainty or risk, right? If you're least confident, you said, well, I made this assumption, and I don't know, I could be off by 20, 30, 40%. Then you really want to do sensitivity analysis on those variables, not the ones where you think you might be off by 5% one way or the other. Right? But so if a recommendation is the same within a reasonable range of scenarios, it is considered robust, right? It's robust to deviations from your assumptions. And then the last part of step 7 is the risk assessment, right? What might happen, what risks might change our forecasts? In particular, what risks might affect the expected outcome or impacts from pursuing this course of action, right? Might affect our ability to achieve the stated benefits, might influence the cost of solving the business problem, right? And for each of the risks, assess the likelihood it will occur, estimate the magnitude of the effect. If it occurs, how much does it affect the benefits, will affect the costs, and develop a mitigation strategy, where appropriate. Something of sufficient likelihood and sufficient impact you want to mitigate. So overall, with 7A, B, C, D, and E, what are some of the questions you want to ask at this stage, right? Well, does it, when 7A is the choice you make, does the cost-benefit analysis demonstrate how the preferred course of action best satisfies the selection criteria, right? Is it well explained, why the chosen action is the chosen action, right? Are the second and third order effects identified? And are the negative impacts acceptable? What about sensitivity analysis? Sensitivity to the recommendation of changes in assumptions, constraints, costs, benefits, criteria, weights, etc. Right? And how large a change can occur before the recommendation changes? Right? It's very helpful to say, not just that this is the recommendation, but tell me at what point, how far wrong do you need to be in your cost estimate for the choice to change? Right? If your cost estimate is 10% too high, and the estimate for this other one is 10% too low, does that change the results? Right? How large a change can occur without changing the recommendation? That's about how much confidence you can have, right? And again, risks. Identifying risks. Have you identified all the likely risks, and do you have a strategy for recommending mitigating those risks? And do those strategy that approach to risk mitigation make sense? Is it adequate? Is it an adequate approach, and is it an affordable approach? So the eighth and final step in the cost-benefit analysis process is to report the results and recommendations. Right? And so the report, of course, summarizes the analysis. And in particular, it concludes with describing how you rank the alternatives, particularly if there are more than two, if there are 3, 4, or 5 alternatives, how they are ranked according to the chosen selection criteria, and ultimately presenting a firm recommendation about which of the alternatives is chosen. It also, in the report, though, provides not just those final recommendations, but sufficient background documentation, right, that allows decision makers to understand how the steps were conducted, how the result was reached, and ultimately possibly even replicate your analysis. What are the elements of a good CBA report? Well, a fully documented CBA in narrative form, right? Not a set of slides, not a spreadsheet, but a written document that describes, how you went through the process, defines the problem, how he talks about each of the 8 steps, right? And certainly conclude by saying how the alternative courses of action were measured and ranked, which course of action was ultimately recommended and why and how you chose assumptions and alternative courses of action. And again, enough detail so your analysis could be replicated if somebody wanted to make for example, adjustment in one of your assumptions and do the analysis again. If you did do spreadsheets, include the spreadsheet that we use for any calculations. The third element should be a summary presentation for the decision maker, because the analyst is going who does the cost benefit, the person who does the cost, or the group or team that does the cost benefit analysis is not necessarily the ones who are going to present the cost benefit analysis to the decision maker, right? So they should produce a ready to go sort of presentation. There's actually an Army cost benefit analysis template that I can provide you. It's the best one is actually that I have is actually in PDF format. So I have one in PowerPoint format that's a template. It's not quite as good as the one I have in PDF format. So ideally, I'd love to have a PowerPoint format of the nicer one. But I can post those online on Sakai for you to use going forward. And lastly, a table summarizing the major assumptions used. Right, this sort of highlight the assumptions. Why and how each assumption was made, and how each assumption was used. Why did you need to make that assumption, and how did it come into play? Did it come into play in terms of your calculation of costs, calculation of benefits, both, something else, right? And describe how changes in each assumption affect the results. So you're going to highlight the key assumptions. You're going to highlight which ones, for example, the results are highly sensitive to certain assumptions versus another. So I can not only look at a table that summarizes what the assumptions were, but which ones really matter. What sort of questions should you be asking if you're reviewing cost benefit analysis when you're looking at the final report and results of recommendation? Right? First of all, of course, does the report contain all the key elements that I just mentioned? The narrative, the spreadsheet, the summary presentation, the table of assumptions? Is a firm recommendation provided? Right? I had you, for example, read a cost benefit analysis of the military intervention in Iran this week. Well, there's no recommendation provided there, so it wouldn't pass that test, right? They sort of avoided that political football, if you will. Does the recommended course of action clearly and effectively address the problem? Does the report explain how that course of action best satisfies the selection criteria, right? Say, okay, these are the criteria, here's how it performed. Really convince me, not only that you've got the right selection criteria, but that clearly this course of action is the one that best satisfies those criteria. And are we all also, providing sort of the background, the assumptions. Are they fully documented? Or does the report provide enough documentation overall so that we can replicate your analysis? So in sum, we've now gone through the overall Army cost-benefit analysis process. Right? And we can see, these 8 steps, and we have nuanced elements of each of them, and step 7, for example, has 5 elements alone, right? But you get the idea of what goes into it, right? And this gives you a good approach for conducting actual cost-benefit analysis, but it also gives you, if you're not doing the cost-benefit analysis yourself, you are now going to be an informed consumer of that by knowing what the steps that should go into that, right? And ultimately, like I said, it's simply an idea of when you're deciding, in particular, whether you should go or no go, whether you should make a choice or not, you got to make sure the benefits, quantifiable and non-quantifiable, balance or outweigh the costs, whether they be quantifiable or non-quantifiable. So with this part of the presentation, we went through the cost-benefit analysis step by step. And in the last part that I will record separately, I will cover the last 4 bullet points here, starting with my suggested revisions of the CBA process we just went through. How do I think that could be tweaked or improved, or are there things that might be overlooked that you should at least have in mind?